Hello, this is Political Update. I am your host, Christopher Devine, and today we have with us United Independent candidate for governor, Evan Falchuk. Thank you for being with us, Evan.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and why you chose to run for governor.
So I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts. I live there now with my wife and our three kids who are 13, 10, and 6. And the beginning of my career, I was a lawyer down in Washington, D.C. for a little more than 5 years. In 1999, I moved back here to Massachusetts to join a healthcare company called Best Doctors, which is an employee benefit. It helps people make sure they've got the right diagnosis and treatment when they're facing an illness. And during that time, I was the president, I was the vice chairman, I was the chief operating officer. But we grew from 9 employees when I started in 1999 to today, where the company has over 600 employees, and it's a global business. I announced I was running for governor back in February this year, and I left Best Doctors at the end of June to pursue United Independent Party and my run for governor full time.
Right, so I saw that you recently created the United Independent Party. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how that differs from the other 2 major parties here in Massachusetts?
The political process today in America and certainly here in Massachusetts is very polarized. And everybody knows that it's polarized, but I think the larger issue is that it's become disconnected. Voters' priorities are not being reflected in the kinds of policies that our elected leaders are pursuing. And you see it in the fact that 53% of voters in Massachusetts have chosen not to be in one of the political parties. Under the law, they're called unenrolled, but normal conversation, we'd say independent. It's the largest voting bloc in the state. It's growing. And interestingly, Massachusetts has the highest percentage of independent voters in the country. And if you look at the data from other states, we've got in the Northeast 4 out of the top 5 states in terms of percentage of independent voters. So there's a level of dissatisfaction that people have with the political process. There's a level of disconnectedness. There's a level of disinterest in participating. More than 60% of the races in our state legislature over the last 2 years had no opposition in them. So I see that, and I see those as symptoms of a larger, deeper problem, which is the need for politics to be something that reflects the priorities that people have and not a political ideology. That's what's missing. So because I have the views of someone who's, I say everybody is equal, everybody's civil rights have to be protected, we have an obligation to help other people, and the government should not waste money, and the government should spend its money sensibly. The trouble most voters have is if you've got those 2 points of view, where do you go? They don't feel as if either of the parties represents that. And I've heard voters say to me, I don't think there's any place to go even to have a rational conversation about these things. And that's the problem. That's what I'm addressing by creating the United Independent Party. Let's create a new vehicle, a new platform to make it possible for new, smart, independent people to become involved in our political process and really change the political conversation in our state.
Right, so how would the Falchuk administration, if you were elected governor, differ from the Patrick administration? So he has had pretty good approval ratings over his term as governor. What would you do differently versus what would you do the same as he has done?
Well, the issues that we've got in Massachusetts, and this is not just a Massachusetts problem or a Governor Patrick issue, is that people do not have confidence, faith, or trust in our state government. They just don't have it. I've been in more than 50 cities and towns across the state since I announced that I was running. And I get into conversations with thousands of voters in lots and lots of different settings. And over again, the theme you hear is a sense of, I don't trust what the government is doing. And the top issue that they talk about is, I don't trust how the money is being spent. I had a voter the other day say to me that she thought that no one really even cares anymore, that no one's paying any attention to how the money is being spent or whether it works in terms of how it's being spent. So for me, the top priority is you have to restore that. You have to re-earn that trust. I'm a business person, and if you had a business where you lost the trust of your customers, you better make sure that that's your number 1 priority, is earning that back, or you're going to be in a lot of trouble very, very quickly. So when we think about our state budget in Massachusetts, the state spends about $35 billion a year, and there are many programs that aren't funded properly. There's many spending measures that go towards things that aren't needed, or you could question whether they're worthwhile or not. I think we can go through that budget, and I know we can, with a really fine-tooth comb and find some of those big and small things that are being done that don't make any sense to do, and stop doing them and reallocate that money for other purposes. If only 3%, think about this, only 3% of the state's spending is misallocated. In other words, spent in a way that doesn't match with priorities that we want to see, that's $1 billion a year. That's $1 billion that could be spent for education programs, for computers in schools, for job training, for transportation initiatives, all sorts of things that we hear today there's not money for. It's there. It's just a question of having the wherewithal and you know, for want of a better word, the guts to say, let's create a different way of doing this. So for me, that's my number one priority. That's one of the big things that will be different with me as governor versus what we see out there today.
Right. So I know you brought up the transportation here in Massachusetts. So what are some things that you would do, or if you would do, to continue to fund the transportation system here in Massachusetts? And would you create a better way for people to get into Boston? Because right now, if you live out west in the state, there really is very few options in how to get into Boston in regards to public transportation.
All these issues there's a history to them that's really, really relevant when we think about what we want to do about them. And I think it's one thing very common in the political process is we sort of react to each new problem and come up with new programs to deal with them. We should be stepping back and looking strategically at how we're dealing with transportation issues. And I have to say, I have to give the governor credit for trying to do that this year with what he proposed with the transportation plan. I mean, it's been pretty well documented over the last number of decades that we've systematically underinvested in our transportation infrastructure. The things you're talking about, that's because of the way we've made decisions as a state. And to his credit, he said, I want to try to address this. But think about how he did it and what that says about the way the political process is working, not just in our state, but in our country. He proposed in the State of the State address, so sort of like the State of the Union, this large package. We're going to spend this money on transportation. And the way he described it, he said, this is about investing in the future. And when given the choice between investing in the future and not investing in the future, I choose to invest in the future. And so then he told people in the legislature, you need to have the courage to vote for this plan. Now, he's entitled to announce things any way he wants to, but he managed to surprise the people in the legislature with this proposal and set it up in a way that it was almost like saying, you're either with me or you're with the other side, essentially, like we heard from President Bush back in 2001, you know, like we saw with some of the healthcare law back in 2010. You know, if you don't support my big plan that I'm not going to explain to you really well, there's something wrong with you. Now, you can win votes that way, but you lose people. You alienate people. And he ended up being in a situation where they ended up debating behind closed doors, big argument over how they're going to fund this, ended up getting something like a quarter or maybe even as less of the money that was needed to address the transportation problems. And if you go talk to most voters and you ask them, what do you think about the transportation plan, they probably won't know what you're talking about. And they might say to you, if they did, they'd say, oh, you mean the thing where they raised the gas tax? You know, that'll be the only thing they know. And you look at that and you say, we have a problem with how we're funding our transportation needs. And we had an effort to try to do it, and it didn't get done. And now the political goodwill to address the issue has been squandered. So real leadership, in my view, has to do with being able to articulate what it is that needs to get done and building consensus around how to do it and explaining to people why it's important to them. It's not what we've seen. So whatever project we wanted to deal with, and sure, we need to be building South Coast Rail and investing more in regional transit and all these different things, but it has to start with a shared vision of where we're trying to go, and that's what's missing.
Right, so how do you think the state will gather the money to create these wonderful ideas for the transportation system?
Yeah.
Would that involve raising taxes for the people of Massachusetts? Because that is how a lot of the money is funded for these programs.
Yeah, well, they did. I mean, they went and they raised taxes. They raised the gas tax. They did some other things to try to bring in more money, and tax revenues are going up. I look at it and I say two things about it. Number one is we have to be willing to pay for the government that we say we want. All right, and I think too much of what's happened in our country for a number of decades is that we feel like we can have everything but not pay for it, and that doesn't work. On the other hand, if you look at how the state spends its money, there's a lot of money that's spent that ought not be spent, and it could be reallocated for these purposes. So, look, there was news today about this. They're doing a reconstruction of the executive offices in the State House, the governor's office suite. They're spending $9 million to do that. That's a lot of money. And it seems like in a world in which we're hearing from people in our state government that there isn't money to fund programs like new computers in schools or job training programs or these transportation projects, that there are things that we ought to be able to prioritize better. And that's just one very small example of the type of spending that happens. Sometimes it's tax breaks for big companies. Sometimes it's other sorts of just programs that the government starts, but it doesn't stop doing things that don't work, or it starts doing something and then creates multiple versions of the same thing. This is the thing that, as a business person, you'd see that in companies, because it does happen in big organizations, but it is a kind of waste that is almost really low-hanging fruit that you say, let's stop doing those things and move that money into the places where it makes the difference that we're talking about.
Right, so what are some of those things that you would cut funding for, that you would stop in order to raise money for other necessities that the state
Well,
has?
the simple things are things like renovating office suites for $9 million. They spent $15 million on new furniture just over the last 2 years. Now you're starting to get a little bit of money here. There are tax breaks that go to individual companies, big public companies. There's a company called Athena Health that got a almost $10 million tax break to hire people in some buildings it owned or owns already in Watertown, Mass. There's a large public company, Intel, was given almost a $300 million tax break to keep a factory open in central Massachusetts that it wouldn't otherwise have been able to keep open. There's expenditures like that happen in small ways and in big ways that are littered throughout the state's budget, but which are just not addressed. And it's interesting to me when you hear from them, listen, there isn't a way to pay for things. I say, you're not trying hard enough. You're not trying hard enough. You're not looking hard enough.
Right. So that brings up some good points from what you just said. But let's move on to the issue of education in the state, which is a pretty big, important issue, which is also the issue that both Boston mayoral candidates ran on, was their vision of improving
Sure.
the state's or the city's schools and education. So do you have any ideas now of how you would improve education all across the state?
Yeah. It starts with, and again, everything has to be thought about in a strategic way, right? It should not always be about, let's figure out how to deal with one narrow issue. We've got to look at the bigger picture here. And one of the most important things that we need our state government to do, and we do need it to do some important things, is to help small and medium-sized businesses grow in Massachusetts. The economy of the 21st century is driven by those size companies. It isn't the giant. I mean, sure, there will always be some big companies out there, but it's not the economy that it was of the 1950s or 60s or 70s, even though so much policymaking still looks that way. They still treat it that way. And what does it take to help small businesses grow? Well, they need to have employees that are able to work, that are creative, that are open-minded thinkers, that do have certain job skills, obviously. And that requires an educational system that creates students that are able to do well at those things. So much of what happens in our schools, now you could be in a very beautiful community like Dover where kids come from good stable family environments. They don't have the same kind of challenges that kids might have in less privileged areas. And the needs and the ability of kids from those places to do well, not just on standardized testing, but also in a more holistic way, is much better in a community like this. In other areas, they need to have more help. And it is about how do you direct resources for things like social workers? How do you make sure that creative education becomes an important part of how every kid learns? Whether it's through the arts. Being a creative person requires being able to do a lot more than math and science. And it's wonderful to do well in math and science, but there's more in the world to contribute if you can be that kind of a thinker. And that's a lot of that way that the educational system needs to be rethought of. And there's some movement on that. There are a lot of things that are happening in Massachusetts to try to address that. And then some of the stuff is purely a funding issue. There's been a formula in place for some decades now about the way that money gets apportioned among the cities and towns. And there are people that are calling for that to be re-looked at, and I'm one of them, to say we need to make this more equitable so that cities and towns with less resources are able to get appropriate resources for their schools.
Right, so what are some ways that those cities and towns would access those resources to improve
The
their
way
schools?
the way the law works now is that the state has defined a minimum. They call it a minimum level of funding they need to have in order for the school to run its programs, and then it's optional for each city and town to be able to fund it above that level. So each city and town, regardless of how they are funding their education, gets a piece of that state money. A different formula might look at it and say, listen, maybe if cities and towns are spending so much more, maybe they don't need as much state aid. Or if there are cities and towns that are spending so much less, maybe we need to raise what that minimum threshold is to try to rise up those levels of standards that need to be put in place. But a lot of it starts with how do you help drive the growth of more small and medium-sized businesses. That's the job generators. That's where, if you're a state and your revenue comes from the taxes that you collect from people making profits and having incomes, that's the driver. That's the driver. And with 7%, 7.2% unemployment, it makes everything that much harder.
Right. So with that 7.2% of unemployment here, what are some ways would you, like we mentioned earlier, be willing to give tax breaks to those companies who would be willing to hire more people to reduce the unemployment rate?
Well, the largest issue I know that we faced in my company when we would hire employees in Massachusetts was the very high cost of health care in Massachusetts. We've got terrific doctors and medical care here in our state, but the cost of it is higher than any other state in the country by a lot. Even by certain pretty conservative estimates, if you were to take out the fact that the state has more teaching hospitals, more science, and more severely ill people being treated here, we still are 15% more expensive than any other state in the country. So what drives that? And you start to look at it and you say, there are 3 insurance companies in Massachusetts that have 79% of the market. And there's a small and increasingly exclusive group of hospital systems that control about 72% of the market. These are according to statistics that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts published a little bit earlier this year. And there's a point at which, when you see markets that get that concentrated with such market power in the hands of such few entities, that they start to act in ways that are anti-competitive. They start to do things like have prices be higher than they otherwise would be because they can. And it's sort of normal economics. I mean, we've known this in our country since we started passing antitrust laws back in the early part of the 20th century, latter part of the 19th. That's a big part of the dynamic of what's happening in our state. The state government has an obligation to do something about that. It has an obligation to take those actors and tell them you can't do the things that you're doing, to enforce existing laws, to maybe make those companies into smaller versions of themselves. But if I'm a business person and I think that my largest cost, regardless of my tax rate, because I may not make any profit because I'm spending so much on health insurance, is that reducing how much money people have to spend on health coverage is probably the most powerful thing you can do to help small and medium-sized businesses grow in this state, more so than anything you can do with the tax code. Now, I think there should be things done with the tax code. Our corporate tax rate is higher than many other states, and is not progressive in any way. So those types of things are part of an overall package that you have to look at. But we should be looking in many cases at what is the root cause, what's really driving the problem here. And I look at healthcare costs as one of the most important areas.
Right. So the number of or the amount of taxes that those companies pay, how did that benefit the Massachusetts economy? Does that go towards funding that we need, that is a necessity? Or if we cut those taxes that they pay, will that then in return increase them to hire more people?
You're talking about the small businesses
Right,
in our state?
right.
Yeah, I mean, look, taxes, it matters. And I think it matters, look, for small businesses when you really are at the early stage of growth, it's so important to have cash. It's so important. You need it. You need it just to be able to run your operations. You don't have access to big bank lines of credit and other things. So every dollar is so much more precious to a small business than it is to a much larger one. And so anything that helps those businesses keep more of that money helps them survive and then make it to the next level where maybe they start to hire a few employees. And then maybe they could be like Best Doctors was. We were a small business that turned into a medium-sized one. Maybe you could call us even big as a $200 million company. But that happens through hard work and time and effort. If you're a venture-backed company, a startup, like we have so many here in Massachusetts, those tax rates make a difference. You might move, if you're starting up and you've got an idea, you might go to another state where the cost of living is less, where tax rates are lower, where healthcare costs are lower. It might be better for you because you've got to maximize your profits. So these are all part of an overall picture that business people take a look at when they've got a choice of where to go. And then for people that are here because this is where they live and they want to raise their families, because this is a great place to do those things, we need to make the conditions such that it is easier for them to do what we need them to do, which is to grow their own businesses. And this is true across the state. You know, I've done a lot of work in I've done a reasonable amount of work up in a place in Lawrence, Massachusetts, with an organization that works with, because I speak Spanish, because my father's side of the family comes from Venezuela, and a lot of the business I've done over the years has been in Latin America. But in Lawrence, where there's a very strong Dominican community, where it is an underprivileged area. They have a lot of challenges in that city. But there are programs that are working with small business owners in those communities to help them when they've made it past that level where they're viable, they're alive, and the question is, how do you go to the next level? There are private organizations that give training and mentoring and skills and networks of people that will help you grow and get larger. Not enough of our state's focus in terms of economic development looks to working programs like this, and instead is focused on very traditional, old school ways of addressing problems of inequality and poverty that just don't work. And we need to be bold enough to step up and say, this can be different, we can do it better, and it's possible to do. It's not some dream. There are people actually doing it today. Let's allocate some of the state's funding for that purpose and change those communities.
Right, so when the election comes next year, what do you think will be the top issues that voters will have on their minds when going to the polls, and how do you plan on addressing those for them?
Well, what I've seen from being out there talking to voters is the issue that's on their minds is that they're not happy with the political process. I mean, and I think the extent to which, and I don't say this because I'm creating my own independent party, I'm saying this because that's what's on voters' minds. You can bring up issues, and people will get interested in talking about whatever the issue is, but at the end of the day, the level of dissatisfaction out there with the way the parties are working right now is at levels that is certainly based on polling data is as high as it's ever been. So what I think voters are looking for is this question: will we be better off as a state if we have a governor who is independent of the party machines and independent of the interests that fuel those party machines? Will we be better off? That's the question that I think voters are going to be asking themselves as they move forward. Is it possible to create a new political party in the state of Massachusetts, which has been the home of so much political change, progressive change in our country, new social changes have started always here in Massachusetts? Will it be possible to create a party here so that new independent candidates can get on the ballot? So we can show to not just ourselves, but everybody around the country that it's possible to do things differently than the left-right debate. We don't need to be in that rut anymore, and there's a way out. I think that's going to be the thing that's most on voters' minds, more than anything else. It is the sort of the feeling of the day today, and it's sort of the sense of the times that we're in, and that's what we have to address. That's why I'm doing this.
Right, so do you think Massachusetts having an independent governor could get so much more done than what they have now, with the two parties just being totally separated from each other?
I think so, and I'll tell you why. There is a good example is Angus King, who was the governor of Maine. He's an independent. He governed. He was reelected. He had 2 terms as an independent governor, and then was elected to the U.S. Senate as an independent, where they could certainly use more independence. He governed very effectively, and part of the reason is because he was not from either of the 2 parties. There were 2 things that were interesting. One of them was that he could build coalitions of people who were not tied to either of the party structures. In other words, he could say, this is the right thing to do, who's with me on this? And that's an interesting way to lead. That's the way that we should want our leaders to lead. The second thing is, and this is a very practical thing, when you think about all the people you've got to hire in state government as a governor, typically, if you're a candidate of the Democratic or Republican parties, you're going to start hiring from people who are registered with your party and are party loyalists. As an independent, I get to choose from everybody, not just from the percentage that might be in my party. So if I were a Democrat, I get to pick from the 35% of people that are Democrats. If I were a Republican, the 11% who are Republicans. That's my first set of choices. I'd rather pick from the 100% of people that are in the state and pick the most qualified, most capable people to serve in those important positions. That's how you run a business, and that's the same way you should run a state.
Right. So, in your time campaigning so far, what have been the biggest surprises that you have faced on the campaign trail, and what are some of the issues like we talked about earlier, that a lot of people are bringing up that you may have not heard of before you started to run?
When I started to do this, I had the belief as a voter, because I haven't been in politics before, that I felt that the way that the process was working politically was not headed in a good direction. That someone needed to come onto the scene who could say, we don't have to fit into these boxes anymore and not politicize everything that happens, and try to figure out what's the right answer to things. That was my motivation. And as I've gone out there to meet people, I've been really surprised to find out how many people share my view. It's a lot of people. You know, one thing that's been surprising is when I tell people that 53% of voters in Massachusetts are independent, they're usually surprised to hear that. They oftentimes will say, hey, I'm independent, but people don't realize that they're in the majority. And when you think about how important social change happens, it happens when the majority of people realize that they're in the majority and the kind of change that they can create. So that's been interesting and surprising and incredibly motivating. I've always been a believer that we live in the world that we live in, and it is the way that it is, either because we make it that way or because through our inaction we let it get that way. And when you meet with voters who are saying that I'm not happy with how things are, and they're not saying I don't care, they're saying I want it to be different, and they're just looking for a way forward to make that happen. And that's what United Independent Party is all about.
Great. Well, on that note, we're going to finish off our interview here. We wish you the best of luck on your campaign trail for governor. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm Christopher Devine, and this is Political Update.